Good day, grade 11 learners. Welcome to the grade 11 lesson. My name is Shabnam Sukhnandan. This lesson is brought to you by Sci-Bono Discovery Center in collaboration with the Gauteng Department of Education. Today's lesson is going to be on flowers as reproductive structures as well as animal biodiversity. Now, do you remember the last lesson we spoke about the divisions to which all the plants belong, and one of the main things was that flowers belong to the division called angiosperms. Now, flowers have two main functions. One, it contains and protects the reproductive organs, and it also attracts pollinators. Now we need to know what are the four main whorls of a flower. All parts of the flower are actually modified leaves arranged in whorls. So when you look at a flower, you find that nothing is haphazard about it. It has a specific way in which the outside is arranged to the inside. Now it's arranged in four specific ways and four whorls. The four whorls of a flower, the main parts of the flower is the outer calyx, then you get the inner corolla, and then you get the male part. Remember last term we actually spoke about the filament and the anther, and that forms the stamen. Well, the andrecium is another name for stamen. And then you remember we spoke about the stigma, style, and ovary, which forms the pistil. So another name is called the gynecium. Just like a female, human female will go to the gynecologist for female reproductive disorders. Same thing, the word gynecium got to do with female, the female reproductive parts. So when you're looking at the four whorls, you find that the calyx and the corolla are the outermost whorls, and that the andrecium and the gynecium are actually the innermost whorls, because they are serving a very important function, so they need to be very well protected by the calyx and the corolla. Now let's look at the calyx and corolla, which are your two outermost whorls. Remember that the calyx has green leafy structures. So those green leafy structures, green, what does it mean? It has what? Chloroplast. So that's very important, because the calyx on its own is able to photosynthesize and transport food for the flowers, for the andrecium, for the gynecium. Right. So the green calyx is the little leaves of the calyx is called sepals, and they protect the part called the petals, and the petals form your corolla. So you have here is your sepals, and this whorl here is actually what? Forming part of your calyx. So your sepals form the calyx, and your petals forms your what? Corolla. Okay? And here you got your anther. Remember your anther? And here you have your filament. And together, what do they form? Your andrecium or your stamen. Another word for stamen is your andrecium. It's very important that you know both words, because you don't know which word they will ask you in the exam paper, stamen or andrecium. So it means one and the same thing. Right. Now, this is the carpel, and the carpel is actually the whole part that encloses your ovary. Your entire ovary with the ovules is called your carpel. Now, what do the calyx and corolla, the two outermost whorls, calyx and corolla together are called the perianth. So we call what? The petals of the flower of the rose or the tulip, right? And together with the green sepals here, so together it's called the perianth. Remember that word, perianth. Always test yourself with the vocabulary by writing it out, by drawing on a page, and that's how you're going to remember the words. Also associate your words with a picture, and that's how you're going to remember the parts without getting confused. Now, what are the floral parts? All the floral parts. That means your petals, your sepals, together with the reproductive parts, they have to be attached to something. So what are they attached to? They are attached to a part called the receptacle. So here is your receptacle. Can you see? The sepals, then the petals, then the entire carpel enclosing the carpel enclosing the ovules and the ovary is attached to this part called the receptacle to receive. It's holding the whole thing into its position. Right. So here's your sepals again. Now what is the actual flower attached to? Remember, we have a stem, and from the stem you're going to break the flower. So that part to which the flower is attached to the stem, this is called a pedicel. So remember, there's 3 different words. Pedicel is the part attaching the flower to the stem. Receptacle is the part attached that encloses the entire ovary with the ovules. That develops. Remember, last lesson we learned that the actual ovary after fertilization forms a fruit, and that the ovules form seeds after fertilization. So they will all be enclosed in the in the carpel. That is this whole part is called the carpel. And here you can see the ovary, here you can see the ovule, and there you have your sticky stigma, your style, and your ovary, which forms what? The female pistil. Another name for this is called what? Gynoecium. Right. And there's your petals, which forms part of which whorl? The corolla. And remember, the corolla and the sepals, which form the calyx, actually is called what? The perianth. So the more and more you go over your work, the more familiar you will become with the terms relating to the flower. So here you have your anther and your stamen forming the stamen, remember, which is also called the andrecium. So we would say that the pistil, or the female part, together with the stamen, the male part, are the essential whorls. Why essential? Because without them, there will be no further reproduction. Flowers can become extinct. So therefore, the male and the female parts are needed for fertilization and to continue with the species. Now, let's look basically at only the andrecium. The stamens are the male part of the flower, consisting of the filament and the anther. Remember, last lesson we said that the anther produces pollen grains, or we called them microspores, which were diploid. And remember that the anther is bilobed. That means if you look at this anther, it actually, you can see that the anther has a lobe like that, and then you have your filament. So it's bilobed, 2 lobes. And inside each lobe, you're going to get what? You're going to get your microspores, which are diploid. And what must the microspores or pollen grains undergo now? They must now undergo meiosis, right? They must undergo meiosis. So the pollen grains, right? They must undergo meiosis to produce what? Haploid male gametes. So the pollen grains contain male gametes which were produced by meiosis. And meiosis is what? It's a halving division. It ensures that the chromosomes in the nucleus will become half, so that when the 2 gametes come together, it gives the constant chromosome number of that species, of that particular flower. Remember, learners, that next year in grade 12, when you're doing meiosis in details, one of the most important thing or function of meiosis is that it ensures that each species keeps its chromosome number constant by halving the chromosome number in the gametes. So in other words, for example, in humans, we have 46 chromosomes. So the sperm cell of a human male must have 23 chromosomes. The nucleus of the female ovum must have 23 chromosomes. So when those 2 gametes come together, 23 plus 23, it's going to give you a constant chromosome number of 46 in a human. Same thing in a flower. Each flower has its own chromosome number. For example, a rose may have 8 chromosomes. So there'll be 4 chromosomes in the sperm cell or in the pollen or the male gamete of the pollen grain, and there'll be 4 chromosomes in the female gamete of the ovule, and when that 4 and 4 come together, it gives you 8. But who have the chromosome number is meiosis. So this is a very important fact that needs to be taken into grade 12. Now, if you look at the female whorl or the gynoecium, So first we did the andrecium. Now we're looking basically at only the female whorl here. And you have the stigma. Remember, the stigma must be sticky. So if it's found within the flower, it must be sticky, so that when the pollen lands on the stigma, it doesn't fall off by the wind. It will stick onto the stigma, the pollen grains, to form a pollen tube which grows down the style, moving towards the ovule in the ovary. So here is your sticky stigma. Then your style. Remember, your style supports your stigma. And your main thing is your ovary here. And inside there is your ovules. How many ovules can you see in this ovary? You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So how many seeds will form in this fruit after the ovules are fertilized? Remember, the ovary becomes swollen to form the fleshy fruit, and the ovules will develop into seeds. So if this is a flower from an apple tree, then you're going to have what? You're going to have 6 seeds inside that fruit because they have 6 ovules. Here's your receptacle to which all your floral parts are attached. That means your calyx, corolla, andrecium, gynoecium are all attached to the receptacle. And remember, pedicel attaches the flower to the main stem. Right. So we are done with andrecium, male whorl, gynoecium, female whorl. Now, what are those whorls essential for? Remember, for every part there has to be a significant function. Your sepals protect the petals, plus they photosynthesize. Remember that your sepals form part of the calyx. Now, children, remember that the corolla is colored brightly. Why must it be colored brightly? To simply attract your insects, which are our pollinating agents. And let's name some pollinating agents or insects. You won't really get a fly coming to a flower. So a fly will be attracted more to dirty things, but you have your insects like your bees, your bird. Your birds are also not an insect but an animal, but birds also are attracted to the colorful flowers, and your bees and your butterflies. Those are the insects that are normally attracted to your flower, and they are insect pollinated. Or the floral parts are brightly colored, it will be bird pollinated. So you find pollination. What is the meaning or definition of just the word pollination? Pollination is defined, that means definition, as the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of the same stigma of a different flower of the same species. In other words, pollination is a transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma, either of the same species or to the stigma of a different flower of the same species. So, in other words, what does that mean? It means that if this is a flower now, you can have pollen grains transferred from the same flower to the stigma of the same flower. But then you can have pollen grains transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, but of the same species. Let's look at it practically. If this, for example, is a rose, then you're going to get anther producing pollen from this flower here, from this basic, let's name it this flower, for example, let's name it A, right? A, and that one is B. But there are 2 roses. There's not one is a rose and one is a daisy. They are the same, it's roses. But this is one rose A and that's rose B. Both the roses are red. So here you're going to get what? Pollen grains going from the anther of this flower A to the stigma of flower A. Or you can get pollen grains going from the stigma of flower A, of rose A, to the stigma of rose B. So it can be the same flower or to a different flower but of the same species. In other words, you won't get pollen from a daisy moving into a rose. Right. Now, next one. pollination is vital. Without pollination, without the transfer of pollen, remember, there won't be fertilization, there won't be fruits, there won't be seeds. And without seeds, the farmers cannot plant crops. So then there's going to be a problem with food security. There won't be enough foods, there won't be enough fruits. So all our fruits and vegetables are coming from seeds, and all the seeds are coming from fertilized ovules. And obviously, an ovule must be fertilized by who? By the male gametes coming from the pollen grain. And how must the pollen grains reach the stigma, the ovule? It has to first reach the stigma, which is sticky. And who's going to transfer it? It's our insects or birds or wind. Okay? So now pollination is vital for food crops, example, apples and pears, seed crops, maize. All your mealies are seeds. They were once upon a time ovules. And legumes are like your peas and your beans. And you also have your wheat that gives you flour. So imagine, without pollination, there will be no food on earth. So pollination is very important. And our pollinating insects, like our birds and bees, need to be protected. That is why, learners, veld fires are very, very dangerous, because veld fires actually kill our pollinating agents. And by killing our pollinating agents, we will be deprived of food in the future. We will be killing our fruits. We will be burning our seeds. So therefore, rather remove the grass by cutting it, but not by burning it. So if you see a veld fire, remember, put it off immediately. Do not use water. Use something to put it off before we have to use our valuable water as a resource to put off veld fires. Right. Now let's look at plants. Plants rely on what? Wind, water, or pollinators such as insects, birds, to transfer pollen from one flower to another. Yes, sometimes we also need water. So as the raindrops fall onto the anther, the pollen can also be transferred and swim to another flower. So wind, water, insects, and bird are our pollinating agents. And pollination, we know, is very important. Right, now we go to cross-pollination. Now, what is cross-pollination? Cross-pollination is a transfer from the anther of one plant. See, not one flower now. From one plant to the stigma of another plant of the same species. Right, so basically we know what is that pollination can occur in two ways. One, that the pollen from the same anther of one flower is transferred to the stigma of the same flower, of the same species. Now that can be called self-pollination. Also, you can get pollination where it's transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. Now, what we just indicated, and that will be now cross-pollination, because it's not being in the same flower self. It's going to another flower, but of the same species. So when I spoke about rose A and rose B, and the pollen transferred from rose A to the stigma of rose B, that can be regarded as cross-pollination. Now, cross-pollination is important because it creates genetic diversity. In other words, although every flower looks the same and belongs to the same species, there may be slight changes. So although we are all humans and we even come from the same parents, your siblings, we are still different. Now what makes us different is that the genes, some genes are slightly different because of mutations. So eventually when the pollen grain gets transferred to the stigma, the new seeds will have some changes in them that makes them slightly different. One flower may be slightly slanted, then another leaf may be slightly oval, or maybe the shade of the redness can change. It may be not so red and the other one is very red. So this creates variation, differences in the flowers. It makes everything to have a variety, and that word variety means genetic diversity. So we are genetically different, even our brothers and sisters, yet we belong to the human species. We are not flowers or roses, but we are different because of gametes being genetically different. We're going to learn more about that next year in grade 12 when you do genetics. This means that the offsprings are genetically different to the parent. Why? Because of cross-pollination. But if it's self-pollination, anther of one flower to the stigma of the same flower, then that's self, then you're not going to really create much diversity. And that flower eventually will become very weak. It won't be able to withstand adverse or unfavorable conditions. So genetic diversity makes sure that the species has a better chance of surviving unfavorable conditions. Now that is why if, for example, people, like for example, if you have your cousin brother marrying your cousin sister, you see, where the parents are brothers and sisters and their children now marry each other, that is like, genes within the same family. So it's very possible that the offspring won't be strong and can lead to becoming a Down syndrome child because there is not much variation in the genes, and this leads to many disorders. So self-pollination it is actually going to create not much diversity, and the offsprings will not be very, very strong and can be even diseased, and they won't be able to survive for a long time in the wild. Now, adaptation for pollination. Now, adaptation for pollination through insects. Okay. Now, every single flower is adapted for that pollinating insect. For example, if a flower needs to be attracting a bee, the flower cannot be dull, a very dull, like a brown flower. You see, it's not going to be attractive to the bee, so it won't even visit the flower. So therefore, you find insect-pollinated flowers have the following characteristics: brightly colored, red, pink, yellow. You won't get a green flower. So red, pink, yellow, orange, those are insect pollinated flowers, and will attract what? Your bees. And why will bees be attracted there? Because deep down near the receptacle there is a nectar gland which produces a sweet little syrup called nectar, and the bees actually, the petals attract them, the corolla attracts them, they go down towards the nectar gland to drink the nectar to make honey. So remember, these pollinating agents are not only important for pollination and to form seeds and fruits eventually, but they are also responsible for making honey. So honey becomes even more expensive if our pollinating agents are going to be killed by fires, right, or sprays. Therefore, you find sweet scent attracts bees to make honey. Large amounts of pollen attract butterflies and moths, and large flower heads attract birds. So let us look at the flowers. Here's a white flower. It's also white. It's also very bright. In light, a white stands out. It reflects light. So it's going to attract even your bees. So here is an insect, a bee-pollinated flower. Then you have also here a bee-pollinated flower, right? Lots of actual pollen grains, and even your butterflies can come and sit there. Then here is like a wasp. Now you can see this flower here is like an orchid. It's attracting wasp, which is a kind of a bee, right? Here you can see all your yellow flowers, and they're very sweet smelling. Chrysanthemums, your bees are coming there, and you have even your bees coming to these brightly orange flowers in an aloe plant as well. So you can see even your purple flower, and deep down, what is the bee going to get? The purple attracted it, but mainly it's attracted also by the sweet smell of the nectar. So they're also sweet smelling because of the nectar. The color attracts them by sight, but the smell attracts them by the sweetness of the nectar coming from the nectar gland. So they drink it with the proboscis, and then they take it to their hives and they make honey. So really, you can see that our pollinating agents are very important, and our anthers are very important to transfer your pollen, and obviously our essential female ovule in the ovary is very important, because without that we cannot get our fruits. Now let's look at the insects. A reward for the pollinator. So a reward for the pollinator, such as nectar or pollen, right? So when the pollinator comes, your bee or your butterfly is coming to the flower, it's there for us for it to pollinate. But what is it getting? It's also getting some food, like the pollen. So butterflies have food, right? And pollen is the butterfly's food. Also, some parts of the pollen are taken by the bee to actually make part of their hives. So as much as they're making honey, some of the pollen is actually used to make the actual combs of the hive, coming from the pollen itself. So reward pollinator, nectar or pollen. The anthers and the stigma are inside the flower, so that the insect must brush past them to get to the nectar, transferring the pollen. So as the insect enters the flower, it actually shakes the little thin filament. Remember, the filament of the andrecium, of the stamen, is so thin that a small little insect, one little shake, and then the pollen actually is dusted off the anther onto the back of that bee. Then when the bee moves, it actually will dust off some of that loose pollen onto the stigma, or go to the next flower. And then as it moves down the next flower, the pollen from the one flower on the back of the bee is transferred to the sticky stigma of the next flower. And that's how pollen is going to get transferred. Sticky or spiky pollen grains stick to the insect's body. See, some of the pollen grains are a little bit sticky because they cannot be dry. They will float in the wind and disappear. So large quantities of pollen are produced because some will be eaten by the visiting insects. So you find that lots of pollen is also eaten, I told you, because they need the pollen for food. They also use that pollen to actually regurgitate it from their mouths, the bees, to make your hives, right? So therefore, pollination by insects, what is the insect going to gain? We're going to gain that we're going to get fertilized ovules, we're going to get fruits. Nah? That's what we know. We're going to have flowers. But now, what must the bees or the birds or the butterflies, what do they get? They get the nectar as food. They get the pollen as food. And they use all of that for their own survival as well. So this is called a mutualistic relationship, where the flower, the actual flower, is benefiting from the bee or the insects because it's going to be pollinated. And the flower the bee is benefiting because it's getting its food and its nectar. So this is called a mutualistic symbiotic relationship, which you have learned in grade 10. Now, self-pollination. We said that it occurs when the pollen is transferred between flowers of the same plant, anther and stigma of the same flower. So this is just a little revision again on self-pollination. Now, we know that self-pollination does not bring about genetic diversity. In other words, we won't be getting a variety of flowers. You know, you get a flower, a rose that's very dark red. Then you get a rose that's lightly pink. Then you get a rose which is red with small white dots. So this is genetic variety brought about by cross-pollination. But self-pollination, you're going to get the same kind of flower, and then the gene diversity drops. So they're not going to survive. So how can we prevent self-pollination? How can self-pollination be prevented? The pollen may ripen before the stigma. The pollen will then be dispersed before the stigma is mature. You see? So how are you going to actually prevent self-pollination? You don't want the pollen from the anther of the same flower to actually land on the stigma of the pistil of the same flower. You don't want that. But if both ripen at the same time, then obviously some of the pollen from that anther is going to land on that stigma at the same time. So we don't want that. So therefore, naturally, in nature, to prevent self-pollination, the anther of the one plant ripens, or the stigma will ripen later. So first the anther is ripened or matured to produce the pollen grain. So even if it lands on the stigma, it won't be able to receive the pollen because the stigma is still undeveloped. It's not yet matured. So some of that pollen that's produced by that flower is going to move now to another flower by an insect. So that's how self-pollination is prevented. So that pollen that's matured will be dispersed, means transferred, before the stigma is mature. The second way to prevent self-pollination is that the stigma is mature before it enters in the same flower and will therefore receive pollen from the other plants of the same species. So there's two ways in which self-pollination can be prevented. One, in the same flower, the anther will ripen before the stigma, right? So that means that the pollen from that anther won't fall. Even if it falls on that stigma, there won't be fertilization because the stigma is not yet mature and sticky to receive that pollen. So obviously when the bee visits the flower, the pollen grains from the anther will transfer onto the back of the bee, and then when the bee moves to the next flower, it's going to transfer the pollen from this flower to the next flower. In that way, you're allowing for cross-pollination and not self-pollination. That's if the anther ripens before the stigma. Or it could be the other way, that the stigma will ripen before the anther in the same flower. That means now, maybe another flower's anther has ripened, and then that the pollen from flower B now can be transferred to the stigma of flower A, because now in this case, the stigma, though the pistil is fully developed and mature, therefore your stigma is ready. So it cannot get any pollen from the anther of flower A because the anther is not yet developed. So the sticky stigma of flower A is going to now get pollen grains from flower B. So that's how self-pollination can be prevented. So one, let's just revise it again, that here the anther must ripen. The pollen grains, the pollen may ripen before the stigma, which means that the anther ripens before the stigma, and in this case, the stigma will ripen before the anther. So those are the ways in which self-pollination can be prevented. Some flowers are adapted, like you see, some flowers are adapted to be incompatible with their own pollen. So in some flowers, very rare cases, like probably an orchid, you find that even if the anther's pollen falls on the stigma of the same flower, that pollen grain will not be able to move down, to actually move down the style towards the ovary, because it will not be compatible with that pollen grain of the same flower. It can only receive pollen from another flower. So those are the three ways in which self-pollination can be prevented. Right, just to give you another view of pollinating insects, you can see also most brightly colored flowers work with sunlight. So you can see color only during the day. That means most insects and birds that are active during the day, what is that word called? You learned in grade 10, diurnal. So those flowers which need your insects have to be open. They have to open during the day, because some flowers close at night. Because at night, the birds and the bees and the butterflies are all asleep. So you cannot have a flower that's open at night. So therefore you find that flowers are open during the day for the insects that are active during the day, which is called what? Your diurnal. Right. That means bees, or at night for insects that are active at night, example, your moths. So you do get some flowers which are opened at night, because at night now you have a different kind of a flower, a moth. And those flowers are normally your flattish flowers, your flowers which don't have much color. And you find your moths also, they are pale in color. They are not as brightly colored as a butterfly. Remember, your butterflies which are active during the day are brightly colored because they also camouflage themselves against the color of the petals. So you find a yellow butterfly will normally visit a yellow flower. Why? Why must they camouflage themselves? Because when they're flying to receive their pollen and their nectar, we don't want the birds to actually catch our pollinating agents and kill them, because then they become extinct. So therefore, the colorful butterflies visit colorful flowers also for camouflage, for protection. and in this way for their survival. And we need them to survive for pollination. So here you can see a butterfly which is very, very light will actually land onto all these parts that are sticking up. Here are your anthers, and here you can see some of your stigmas in between. So that butterfly is coming to take the pollen, but as it's doing that, as it's shaking the flower, the anther is actually dusting off the pollen onto their little feet, so that when they land to the next flower, the pollen of this flower from their feet is transferred to the stigma of another flower, allowing for cross-pollination. Here you can also see another brightly colored blue butterfly actually going with its proboscis to get some of the nectar as well, and also the pollen as its food. And then by doing that, the pollen is getting stuck onto the feet, so that when it goes to the next flower, the pollen from the feet from this flower is transferred to the next. So here's our pollinating agents, which are your butterflies. Remember, you also get pollinating agents like your birds. Flowers pollinated by birds usually have the following characteristics. Now, a bird is much bigger and heavier. So a bird, the way the flower is adapted, that if a bird has to be pollinating it, that flower must be quite strong. It must have a very thick pedicel, so that if the bird lands on it, the flower does not break. So obviously the flowers that are bird pollinated have to be very strong. So they produce large quantities of dilute nectar. The flowers are bigger than most insects. So the flowers are so big that they would hang out like a branch, so that the bird doesn't actually sit on the flower, but its beak is able to protrude into the flower to actually get the juices and the nectar. You can see this flower here looks like a bird. So obviously it's going to attract the bird. So how nature has made it that it looks like a bird, so it will attract only a bird and not an insect like a bee. And it's quite strong. You can see the petals are quite firm. You can see that this part of the petal is quite strong, so that even if the bird had to slightly sit on it and protrude its proboscis, it won't break the flower. Look at these flowers also. The petals look quite sturdy, unlike a rose petal, which is very flimsy. So the flimsy rose petals and the flimsy little rose, that needs to be pollinated by a small, light insect like a bee. But here, bird pollinators' flowers are very big, bright petals, quite strong petals, or you find that the flowers are protected by thick, leafy leaves that are very parallel, and they are protecting the flower so that it doesn't droop and fall. Here you also find that this flower is quite big and wide open, so that the bird can poke its beak into the nectar gland to drink the nectar. Here you can see how the flowers pollinated by birds are actually hanging down, making it very easy for the bird to flutter its wings and drink the nectar. So it doesn't need to sit on the flower. As it flutters its wings, it will be able to drink the nectar or get its pollen from the flower. Here also you can see a better view of this flower here now, that the stamens are also hanging out. So as the bird drinks the nectar, this pollen from this anther will be transferred where? Onto the beak of the bird. So with birds, they transfer pollen by means of their beak. Butterflies transfer pollen by means of their feet. And bees transfer pollen by means of their back and their feet, because they go into the flower. The bee is small, and that's how the pollen does onto the back and the feet. Look at this flower also here. It's quite a strong flower, and then the birds actually are able to drink the juice from the inside using its long beak. So also the bird's beak is adapted. So besides the flower being adapted, even the beak is adapted. So you'll know a bird that needs to drink or visit the flower for its nectar. The beak is quite long and curved, thin, pointed, and curved. So as it flutters its wings, it simply puts its beak into the flower to drink the pollen, to drink the nectar, and some of the pollen dust onto the beak. So here you can see this flower again magnified, and you can see how big are the anthers, so that when the bee, or the bird is actually drinking the nectar, some of it falls onto its beak. Remember, bee and bird pollinated flowers are open during the day because birds, bees and butterflies are active during the day, and what they need to be brightly colored and sweet smelling as well. So bird pollinated flowers, they are open during the day, and they are red because red can be seen by birds. So red is easily seen more by birds than by insects. Insects are normally attracted to your orange and your yellow. They're also attracted to the red, but very bright red is attracted by the bird. And you can see how this bird's, the honeysuckle, it's called the honeysuckle, because it loves to drink the nectar. And then you find this bird now is having its long proboscis, which protrudes into the nectar gland. So they also drink nectar as a juice, as a form of water as well for its body, and to give it energy for flight. So the nectar gland is sweet enough to give it its sugars for it to fly. Here also you can see what a long pointed beak. Now if it has a short beak, it means it has to go very close to the flower and can break the flower. But by having a long beak, you can see how the bird is fluttering its wings to keep it aflight while drinking the nectar from the flower. Just looks like it's actually looking for water, but it's drinking the nectar. And obviously, as it's doing that, the anther is producing its pollen onto its beak. Look at this one here. It's such a big flower. Look at bird pollinated flowers. They're very big. So these big flowers, you know that they are bird pollinated. Look at this bird also. It's also fluttering its wings, and there the proboscis, your beak, is actually going into that flower. And can you see what's happening on the top? As it's going to drink the nectar, the anther is going to shake, the flower is going to shake and dust off all the pollen onto the bee's back as well. So when it goes to the next flower and it flutters its wings, then the wing movement will actually blow off the pollen from its back onto the stigma of the next flower. So that's how birds are adapted for pollinating flowers, and that's how flowers are adapted to be pollinated by your birds. So each one is structurally suited for its function. Again, bird pollinated flowers are very sturdy. What's sturdy? Means they're firm. They're not very like flimsy or very thin where they can break off easily. Little or no scent, because birds have a poor sense of smell. So they say that there's little or no scent, but so what attracts the birds is basically their color and the largeness of the flower, and that the stamens are hanging out of the flower. So they're they are very easy to be detected by the bird, because birds have a poor sense of smell but a very good eyesight, like a hawk's eye. They have a good eyesight, so brightly colored, big for brightly colored, B for brightly colored, B for big flowers, B for bird. They are pollinating because the flowers are sturdy, firm, no scent. So birds have a poor sense of smell. You can see this flower here. It's quite strong, and a small little bird like a sparrow, which is not so heavy, or like a small finch, it's going to sit on this flower and get its nectar from there as well. Also, it feeds on some of the pollen. And here you can see again your sunflowers. So a sunflower is quite a big flower. So all our sunflower oils, your sunflower oil that you buy, is coming from where? It's coming from all these sunflower seeds. And you cannot get sunflower seeds if it wasn't for our birds, because these birds are transferring pollen to the anthers of the sunflower, to the stigma of the sunflower. The stigma receives the pollen from the bird. The pollen germinates down the style, goes to the ovary, fertilizes the female gametes in the ovules, and those fertilized ovules become seeds, sunflower seeds, and all those seeds are then cold pressed to form or produce our sunflower oil. So you can see how important are our birds and our sunflowers. So if you see sunflower seeds somewhere along the roadside, you must know that the birds also eat. they also eat the seeds, ne? And by eating some of the seeds, they're also transferring pollen from the stamen. So remember, there'll be some stamens that are unfertilized, stigmas that are unfertilized, because there's many. There's many. In one sunflower, it's so big. There are many stamens or many androeciums and many pistils, ne? And not all of them get fertilized at the same time, because sometimes the bird is attracted by the already developed ovules. They're already the seeds. So they actually eat on the seeds. And then you find as they fly, some of the seeds fall onto the roadsides, onto the ground, or they're blown away, and then you get at random a sunflower plant. So here, these birds, the little sparrow, the little finch, the little honeysuckle, it's all going to be pollinated by, they're actually going to use the big flowers and pollinate them. Right. Pollination again by birds, right, just to show you. So when you are walking along the gardens or in the around the roadsides, or you go to the nursery, you will be able to actually identify which flowers are insect pollinated, which ones are bird pollinated, which ones are butterfly pollinated, which ones could be moth pollinated. Right. So let's see. Ovules are protected from the probing beaks. So how are the ovules protected? Remember, by the carpel, by the fleshy parts, right, which protect your ovary. So the ovules are protected from the probing bug, means the beaks are quite strong, they are quite pointy, so they can damage the ovules. But because of the carpel is so thick and fleshy, when the bee is actually drinking its nectar or getting its pollen, it won't damage the ovules. So the pollen grains stick together in clumps so that the bird picks up enough pollen to fertilize a large number of ovules with just one visit. So remember now, in a bird pollinated flower, the anther produces pollens which are not very dry, but they are sticky and they stick together all at once. So the minute it lands onto the beak of the bird, many pollen grains will be transferred to the flower, to another flower, many, not just one. So many actual ovules can be fertilized at once, and then you get lots of seeds forming at once in one flower. Right, here you can see again the beak, how pointy it is. Flowers are born above the leaves. You see that you have your bird pollinated flowers are not close to the stem, but they're like loose, and they really hang very low from the stem. So they are low hanging, or the flowers are above the leaves. They stick out from the leaves. So if this is your tree and your leaves, then the flower will hang like that. Okay? So here's your main branch, here's your side branches, right? And then here's your leaves, and then from there, your flowers hang above the leaves. So that's what they mean. It hangs or moves above the leaves so that it's free for the bird to actually access it, to reach it. Wind-pollinated flowers. Now we learned about insects and birds. Now your wind-pollinated flowers. So wind pollination is not efficient method of pollination. We need wind to pollinate, but it's not efficient because vast quantities of pollen must be produced in order for some of it to land on a receptive stigma of the right species. It's a wasteful process. So wind pollination, we need wind to transfer, for example, mealies. Now, you don't really see a brightly colored flower on a mealy plant. So those flowers that are not brightly colored, it means they need to be wind pollinated. You learned about the gymnosperms, and they also have ovules on the ovuliferous scales. But for those ovules on the pine cone to be fertilized, we need the wind to blow through those pine needle leaves to actually land onto that ovule. But lots of pollen, because when the wind blows, you don't know where the pollen is going to land. Will it ever land on the ovule of a pine cone? Will it ever land on the stigma of a mealy plant? So in order to ensure that some of the pollen is transferred onto the stigma of a flower that needs wind pollination, lots of pollen has to be produced. So it becomes very wasteful, because the more pollen is produced, the higher the chance of some pollen landing onto the stigma or onto the ovule of the pine cone. So here you can see that this flower is quite dull, and as the wind blows and shakes, the stamens all dust off their pollen and they fly by the wind to land onto the stigma of another flower of the same species. You can see here also that the stem, the anthers are quite long and feathery, right, to produce lots of pollen as it shakes, and there's the pollen dust moving, and that's why you find people sometimes say they have a nose allergy or an allergy because they have pollen, because remember that pollen has to be moving in the air and it's like fine dust which irritates the nasal membranes of humans. So they say they are having rhinitis and allergy because of the nose is itching because of the pollen in the air. But we need the pollen, because without the pollen, as we said, we cannot get trees, we cannot get fruits, we cannot get fruit crops. So we need them. And then you can see here is a dandelion, and this is also wind pollinated, because as these little white florets from the dandelions are moving, it's also moving with their anthers containing the pollen. So these are all wind pollinated flowers. Here, some trees and grasses are wind pollinated, right? So here you can see this is like your wheat. This is your pine cones. Look at this pine cones. Remember when you did gymnosperms that the male cone is smaller and it's found in clusters. And they're smaller because they produce large amounts of pollen. So here's your cluster of male cones. And you see as the wind is blowing, this is not smoke. This is a large amounts of pollen that's dusted into the air by the wind to be transferred by the wind so that it falls onto the ovuliferous scale of the female cone. Remember the ovules of a female cone, the pine cone, was exposed. It was not enclosed in the ovary. So the ovule of a pine cone was exposed so that the pollen can easily land on that open ovule. It was a naked ovule so that it forms a seed after pollination. Right. And here is actually a micrograph of actually a pollen grain. Right. This is a micrograph of a pollen grain. Most of our agricultural crops are wind pollen: maize, oats, and rice. Rice is actually found in your paddy fields. So rice is actually needing water to be pollinated. But your oats and that you have as cereals, your mealies, your cornflakes that comes from mealies, all those plants need wind pollination. So wind pollinated flowers, the anther is loaded with pollen. Loaded means lots of pollen. It dangles loosely. You can see that here is the filament and all the anthers are busy dangling out like that, so that when the wind blows, they will shake and dust off the pollen. So wind pollinated flowers have the following characteristics. They don't need to attract insects. So they don't need to be brightly colored. They don't need to give off a sweet smell because they're not attracting insects. They do not have nectar. The male flowers have large anthers and the stigmas are long and feathery. So you find here is the stigma, for example, of a mealy plant. It's feathery to trap the pollen, right? See, to catch the pollen, the stigma is feathery. So in the multiple choice question, they can put down a characteristic: long feathery stigmas. Ne? So you must know that that one is belonging to a wind pollinated flowers. If they say sticky stigma, then you know that is coming from an insect pollinated flowers. If they say long stamens that hang out of the flower and are loose and long hanging out of the flower, then that could also be with no color, then that is a wind pollinated flower. So here you can see the filament is very long, thin and very long, so that it actually dangles out or hangs out of the flower. So thin, long filament that dangles out, wind pollinated. Ne? Long feathery stigma to trap and catch the pollen, wind pollinated. Okay. Again, just to revise again, that flowers are often small and either green or brown in color because they do not need to attract pollinators. So a dull flower like your wheat. Wheat is like brownish, ne? Brownish, and therefore it's not brightly colored because they need wind to pollinate. So flowers are small and either green or brown in color because they do not need to attract insects. Flowers are borne on flexible stalks to move in the wind. In other words, the flower, the pedicel, né, it's sturdy and it can sway in the wind. Flexible means it can sway, and as it's swaying, it allows the anthers to dust off the pollen. No calyx and corolla, because there's no flower that is colorful, so you don't need a calyx to protect the petals because there's no petals. There's no corolla, which is brightly colored, because all the plant has is its feathery stamens and its feathery stigmas, né? And enormous amounts of pollen is produced. So remember the characteristics which is often tested, that if there's no flower, no calyx and corolla, it's wind pollinated. If the flowers are large and hanging out of the above the leaves, it's wind pollinated as well, né? Okay. Now fertilization. So now it's pollination. So after pollination, we speak about fertilization. So what is fertilization? It is when the female gamete, né, is actually going, or the male gamete is going, the male gamete's nucleus, the male gamete nucleus of the pollen grain fuses with the nucleus of the female gamete to form what we call a zygote, which will divide mitotically. Remember mitosis you learned in grade 10. It will divide mitotically to produce many cells which will now form a new plant. So fertilization is the fusion of the nucleus of the male gamete of the pollen, and it fuses with the female gamete of the ovule to form a zygote. And eventually you find that that ovule that is fertilized will now become a seed. Seeds are then planted to form new plants, and then the plants produce your fruits and your flowers and your leaves, which are essential for life. So when a pollen grain lands on the stigma, it germinates by growing down the style towards the ovule, carrying the male gamete to fertilize the female gamete in the ovule. The fertilized ovule, remember, forms a seed, and the ovary wall thickens to become a fruit. Fruits do not develop without fertilization. So this is basically a life cycle of a plant. Right, that here you have your ovary, remember, with your ovule containing your female, ovary with your ovule containing your female gamete. Your male gamete will fertilize the female gamete in the ovule to form what we call a zygote. The zygote is now going to be forming part of your fertilized ovule, which will become a seed. You plant the seeds, and then when you plant the seeds, it's going to form a plant, again with a flower, right? And then pollination is going to occur, and then you're going to have your fertilized ovules. They form seeds again. The seeds are going to be planted, the seeds found in the fruit. And then when you eat the fruit, you throw the seeds, and then the seeds will now form into a new flower, and the life cycle continues. So remember, from the flower, you're going to get your fruit after the ovules are fertilized. Then when you're eating a fruit, or the birds eat the fruit, seeds will fall onto the ground, produce a new plant, produce flowers. Flowers have anthers and stigmas. Pollination must occur. After pollination, it's fertilization. After fertilization, seeds form. Seeds are found in the fruits. Fruits are eaten. Seeds are thrown onto the ground. New plants, new flowers, and the cycle continues. So this is the cycle of a flowering plant. And in this cycle, you find there's pollination, fertilization, new plant. Pollination, fertilization, new plant, new flowers. Again, pollination, and that's how it continues. So without the two processes of pollination and fertilization, we will not be able to get fruits and flowers and food as well. So now here's some of the activities. Study the pictures below and indicate if they are pollinated by insects, birds, or by wind, and give a reason that is visible. Always remember that you must always answer the question. If they say what is visible, do not write what are some of the characters you know, but that's not visible in the picture itself or in the diagram. So always say what is visible. Now in A, for example, to me what is visible? That it's brightly colored, it's flat, and you can see the anthers and stigma. So if it's brightly colored, it means that this plant is probably insect pollinated. Now let's see. A is insect pollinated. Why? Brightly colored, plus it's an open flower. It gives access to the bees and the butterflies. Let's look at B now. Is it brightly colored? No. Can you see that the flowers are hanging above the leaves? So this is wind pollinated because the stamens are hanging above the leaves. Let's look at C. Then you know this is the pollen, this is a male cone. You can see the pollen grain. So this one is wind pollinated. C, wind pollinated. Large amounts of pollen is produced. So what's visible here is not that the flowers are hanging out. It's also adaptation to wind. But what's specific about this one? Large amounts of pollen can be seen, so it's wind pollinated. Here it's also wind pollinated, but I can't say large amounts of pollen because that's not visible in that diagram B. So here I can see that my flowers are hanging above the leaves. Can you see that at B? So stamens protrude, see, stamens protrude above the flower, or you can say that the flowers are hanging above the leaves. And in D, you can see that these plants here in D, the flowers itself are quite sturdy, and even the stem is quite strong, and they are like dangling out and hanging out, and they're brightly colored, so it can't be wind pollinated. So if it's brightly colored and hanging out, it means it's accessible to a bird. So D is bird pollinated. Narrow flowers on a sturdy stem. See, sturdy means a strong stem, not a thin little pedestal, but a strong stem, and those flowers are long and hanging out and brightly colored, and that's why we know that that is bird pollinated. First of all, it's brightly colored, it's very long, it's on a very sturdy stem, and then you know it's bird pollinated. And then E, you know that these flowers, you must have seen them in your gardens as well. They got very thin petals, very flimsy petals, brightly colored. Actually, these little lines, you know when you have them on a runaway, where those planes actually have those lines or those lights to guide the plane where to land. So in the same way, these are like landing sites for the butterfly and the bee. It's landing sites to direct them exactly where the nectar gland is. So these may look like lines or like little, floral parts of the plant, but this floral part, these little lines are actually honey guides. We call them honey guides. It guides the bees to where the nectar gland is to form their honey. So these little plants here are what? Insect pollinated. You see? Colorful, distinct markings. Those markings are honey guides. And you know it's insect pollen because they're small and they're colorful. And they will even have a sweet scent because insects like bees are attracted to a sweet scent. This is activity 2. Then you can get, these are questions which are very simple. Know your labels, know the functions of each part as well, right? Remember, a diagram with the label and the function of the part is called an annotated diagram. So they can ask you to draw an annotated diagram. That means you must draw a diagram with the label, and next to the label in brackets, you put down the function of that part. That is called an annotated diagram. So let's look at activity 2. Supply labels for 1 to 10. Remember now, 1 is the sepal. So you cannot say 1 is the calyx. 1 is the sepal, but to which world does 1 belong? Then it will be calyx. So children, please remember that when you are answering a paper, answer it according to what they need, and not according to just what you know. What you know, you must apply to the question. So this one part here is the sepal. But if they say, identify 1 and also identify the world to which it belongs. So 1 will be sepal, next to it belongs to the calyx. So 2 is a petal, and to which world does it belong? Corolla, right. Then you can see here, what is this part here? We said all the floral parts are attached to it. That's a receptacle. And what is this part here? Your pedicel. So 3 is your pedicel, 2 is your petal. This is a bract. Bract is simply the leafy part from which your pedicel is coming out from. It's just protecting that little part of the pedicel. It's for protection. And here you're seeing your actual inside of the flower now. So let's look at it. We said 1 is sepal, 2 is petal, 3 is what? 3 is your, just erase this. It's your pedicel. That's your receptacle, although it's not labeled. Remember, you must know all the parts. That 4 is what? That's your filament. You can see the filament is inside. It's protected by the flower petals, right? The filament is protected by the petals of the flower. It's inside. There's your anther there, which is number 5. 4 and 5, filament and anther forms number 6, which is your stamen. What's another name we said? Andrecium. And then you're going to get your sticky stigma, sticky, for the pollen to stick onto it. 8 is your style, which supports your stigma and allows the pollen grain to move down with its tube and the male gamete. And here you're going to have your 9, the carpel, which contains the ovary with the ovules. So 7, 8, and 9, stigma, style, ovary, forms your 10, which is your female whorl, which is the pistil or gynecium. So please revise all the parts of the flower. Learners, now we move on to another part now. From plants, we now move to animal biodiversity. So just remember, before we go to animal biodiversity, remember the plant diversity was what? Your bryophytes, which is your moss, your pteridophytes, your ferns, your pines, your gymnosperms, your flowering plants, your angiosperms, and now we're moving to animal biodiversity. Now, let's look at the animals. As much as plants are important, so are animals. So every living organism on earth has its role and its function to play in our ecosystems. Now, let's look at the word unicellular, protista. So they are, as much as humans are the highest order of animals, you have a very simple animal, which is just made up of one little cell. So one cell with one little nucleus can be an organism, which just moves on its own. So when an organism is made up of just one cell and capable of moving and eating food, that organism is called unicellular. And that is an example of what we call a protista, which you see in the water. It's called an amoeba. So amoebas belong to the division of phylum called protista. It's made up of one cell only. So your amoeba has no tissue layers. It's just a cell. Remember, many cells form a tissue, but only one cell cannot form a tissue. So it's no tissue layers. So this one is basically ancestral. This organism, protista, gave rise to more complex animals. So let's go here. This is ancestral. From there now, we're slowly getting more advanced animals with one gut opening. That means one opening through which food enters and leaves. Mouth and maybe no anus. So one opening. And it forms some tissue layers. Now you're getting a bit more cells. Then that one is going to be what? For example, now you're going to get your sponges. You see, one gut opening. Then from there, it's going to get more advanced now. As time went on, there were more advanced animals like your jellyfish, which is your cnidaria, also having one gut opening. So no tissue layer, sponges or porifera. So no tissue layer is your protista. Then one gut opening and forming tissue layers. Let me just erase this here. Okay. So let's see. Let's start again. No tissue layers, only one cell. Ancestral is your porifera. That's your ancestor. Then it becomes more complex. We're going to get our cnidaria or jellyfish. Your jellyfish has what? One gut opening, and it's going to form tissue layers. Then you're going to get what? Your flatworms. Your flatworms are going to be triploblastic. You read it like this. Your flatworms are going to be triploblastic. Triploblastic simply means 3 body layers. It's going to be bilateral. It means now we're going to see that it can be divided into 2 equal parts. There's another thing, cephalization. It's going to have a head with sense organs. So the flatworm or Platyhelminthes is far more advanced than your Protista. Protista is one cell, sponges are some tissue layers, right? Your jellyfish is your Cnidaria. It's also going to be what? One gut opening. Then you're having a more advanced flatworm, right? Your flatworms. And then from there now, you're going to get your Annelida. And your Annelida is your earthworms. They are even more advanced than a flatworm, right? So your Annelida is going to have 2 openings now, not just one opening like, for example, the jellyfish or the hydra. But the flatworm and your Annelida are going to be triploblastic, and they're going to have 2 gut openings. Okay. Your arthropods are your insects like your locusts, and chordata is your mammals like humans and birds and fish and frog. They form under chordata because they have a backbone. They're very advanced. They have many, many cells, which we call multicellular. They have 3 body layers, which we're going to learn about. So when you have 2 openings, that means now 2 gut openings. You can have a body cavity, a true body cavity, where all your organs are found, true body cavity, coelomate, segmentation, the body is divided into different parts. Then that is very advanced, né? And therefore Annelida is also an earthworm that's very advanced. So this is what we call a phylogenetic tree, to show you also the ancestral organism and how with time organisms become more advanced with different kinds of tissue layers. We're going to learn about body symmetry, right? An organism is symmetrical when it can be cut into 2 equal and identical halves through one or more plane. So for example now, if I take a pizza, I can cut my pizza in many different ways to get equal parts. I don't have to cut it in just one. I can cut it this way, I can cut it that way, or so when I can cut something in any plane to get equal halves, right? That means it's radially symmetrical, like a radius, like a circumference, right? So that's radial symmetry. But if I take something that has no shape, it's just one cell that's busy changing its shape, I cannot cut it into equal halves in any direction. I cannot cut it only in the middle because it's unequal anyway. So when something has no shape and you want to get equal halves, we say something with no shape and cannot be cut into equal halves. No shape, shape is changing, cannot be cut into equal halves. We call that asymmetrical, A. So something that can be cut into equal halves is symmetrical. But if it cannot be cut into equal halves, it's asymmetrical. Also, a multicellular organism can be asymmetrical, no shape, or it can be radially symmetrical, cut along any plane to get equal halves, or it can be bilaterally symmetrical. You can only cut in one angle to get equal halves. Now humans are like that. We cannot cut ourselves in the middle and say that the top half is the same as the bottom half. Here we have a head, here we have our stomach and our legs. So that cannot be bilateral. So if you cut the person in the middle, then you're going to get a left and a right. Left and right equal halves is bilaterally symmetrical. So let's go through it again. An organism is symmetrical when it can be cut into 2 equal or identical halves through one or more planes. So if you can get equal halves, then it's symmetrical. If you cannot get equal halves, it's asymmetrical. If you can cut along any plane, it's radially symmetrical. If you can cut along one plane to get an equal half, it's bilaterally symmetrical. Right, body symmetry. Ne? So you find an organism that is actually asymmetrical here is your amoeba, your sponges, it got no symmetry. So basically your porifera, or your amoeba, which is a protista, your amoeba is always changing its shape, and amoeba actually looks like this. I can change my shape all the time. So it's one cell with a nucleus. So that's an amoeba. And the next time it moves, it could just be like that. You see. So all the time its shape is changing. So that's unicellular. No shape. And therefore I cannot get an equal half. So that one is what? Asymmetrical. Now, no symmetry, they cannot be divided into equal halves. Example, a sponge or an amoeba. Okay? So that's asymmetrical. Then you get radial symmetrical. This is a sponge or a sea anemone found in the sea. And you can see now, I can cut that way, that way, that way, that way, right? I will be able to get equal halves. So this is called here's your circumference, and then from there to there is a radius, from there so along any plane through the center, I'm going to get an equal half. This is a radial symmetry. Example, your sea anemone. So your cnidaria, your sea anemones are actually radially symmetrical, whereas your protista, amoeba, is asymmetrical. Remember that also your sponges can't move around. They actually stick to the base actually attaches itself to a plant or a rock, so that they are freely moving, and then their tentacles move around and dangle to trap insects and food, as well as in the sea as the currents are moving. These tentacles move around and sway around the opening to catch food. So this is your sponges, which belong to cnidaria, and they are radially symmetrical. And the word sessile means they cannot move freely. If you're sessile, it means your movement is limited because the base is attached to a plant or to a rock. That is what's the meaning of the word sessile. Now, body symmetry, bilateral symmetry, all other phyla except porifera and cnidaria. Remember now, your porifera is what? Radially symmetrical. Cnidaria is radially symmetrical. But all other animals which are multicellular, made up of many cells, they are normally bilaterally symmetrical. Even humans, birds, fish, frogs are all what? You can get them into a right and left half, equal halves. That is bilaterally symmetrical, where the body plan is divided into two equal halves. They have a left side and a right side that is identical. They cannot be divided into a front and back. You cannot say, if they cut the goat here, that this half is identical to that half. It's not. Okay? So the only way, if you want to, is you have to cut along like that, you see, and then you're going to get a left and right half to make this goat bilaterally symmetrical. Okay. So that is bilateral symmetry. Animals that have a bilateral symmetry are usually more advanced and have cephalization. So bilateral animals always are more advanced. They have a proper front end with sense organs like your eyes to move forward, to detect danger, to look for food, right? That is cephalization. Remember, sense organs are in the front. Also, it has feeding appendages. All your feeding parts, like the mouth, is also in the front. Né? And they also have a brain. To process information. So most bilateral organisms are actually much more advanced because they're multicellular. They can be divided into two equal parts. That's bilaterally symmetrical because they're multicellular and because of cephalization. Animals with a bilateral symmetry are active and are constantly moving around in search of food, mates, interacting with the environment. So because the environment can have danger as well, by moving forward, we cannot move backwards. They move forward. And by moving forward, your sense organs have to be in the front. You're interacting with the environment, you interact with your water, your food, your danger. So all those things, your cephalization must be found in the anterior end. Anterior end means, front end. Front end means your sense organs. Sense organs in the front or anterior end, what's the word? Cephalization. This is for more advanced animals like your birds, your goats, your chickens. You name all the animals that you interact with and can see and can moving forward. That is, most of them are bilaterally symmetrical with cephalization. Right, your tissue layers now. Now we said we have one cell is unicellular. Many layers are going to be multicellular. Now let's look at the layers. The first layer of cells in an embryo that forms on the outside is called, or the actual layers from the zygote, it develops one layer called the germinal layer. Now this germinal layer will give rise to many more layers. So the first layer, or the germinal layer, the germ layer, please do not think that of germ as a bacteria. The word germ comes from the word germinal epithelium. So the primary germinal epithelium gives rise to the first layer of tissues, the first layer of cells, which forms a tissue. Many cells form a tissue. So the first layer of cells forms your ectoderm tissue. That's your outer layer. Ecto means outer. Then the second layer of cells, which form the next tissue, the inner layer will be the endoderm. So endo means inside. So your primary layer gives rise to your ectoderm tissue, and then you have your endoderm tissue, which is inside. The ectoderm will develop into skin or epithelium and the nervous system of the animal. Think of it logically. What is on our outside? We can see the skin. The skin developed from the ectoderm. We can see the eyes on the outside. It developed from the ectoderm. Right. We can see the mouth, the tongue. It developed from the ectoderm. So the ectoderm gives rise to the outer layers or outer tissues, right? The ectoderm. And the endoderm will give rise to all the organs inside the animal. Basically, your digestive system, your heart, and things like that. It comes from the inside, right? The endoderm. So the endoderm will form, for example, the inside, the digestive system. Diploblastic means two layers. So if an animal has only two germ layers, outer ectoderm and inner endoderm, two layers, and you can see outer ectoderm, inner endoderm, then this is called what we say diploblastic. Diplo means two layers, ectoderm and endoderm, which we find where? We find it in our flatworms, okay? In our flatworms, Platyhelminthes. Triploblastic means now we're going to have three body layers, three germinal layers. So you have the mesoderm being added now. So you have ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm. Meso means middle. Ecto means outside. Endo means inside. And what's between the ecto and the endo is your mesoderm. So you're going to have a mesoderm. It's a secondary germ layer which develops between, in the middle of the ectoderm and the endoderm. Animals with three layers, ecto, endo, and mesoderm, are called triploblastic, like your earthworms, your annelids. They belong to the phylum called Annelida. So earthworms are quite advanced because they have a proper front head end with sense organs. They don't have eyes, but the front end is very sensitive, so they can move forward. They do not move backwards. But they got three layers, ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. And then they don't have bones. You cannot find a bony earthworm. So what they have inside of them is, you find now in the endoderm, you have your ectoderm, your mesoderm, and your endoderm on the inside. So from the endoderm on the inside, there's a hollow cavity filled with fluid. This hollow cavity here is called a coelom, and that acts as a hydrostatic skeleton. So when the earthworm moves with its segmentation forward, now all its muscles contract and relax against a watery fluid, which is firmness, forming a hydrostatic skeleton. That's formed from this cavity with water. This cavity with water is filled with coelomic fluid. And what does it act as? A hydrostatic skeleton. Now remember, learners, that we have a hydrostatic skeleton, we as humans and frogs and birds have a skeleton inside, which is an endoskeleton. Then you have your locusts and your cockroach and your crabs, which have a hard part outside. That's your exoskeleton. So exoskeletons develop from ectoderms, né? And we have a bony parts of our body which develop from the endoderm. And here you find in the earthworm, they don't have a bony part, but the endoderm gives rise to the coelom, which acts as a hydrostatic skeleton. Right. Now, let's look at the different openings. Né? So, when an organism has only a mouth to take in food, and also undigested food also leaves through the mouth, one opening. That one opening, okay, it's called a blind ending gut. Blind ending gut. Now, not two openings. One opening like a mouth is which is used to ingest food and also expel undigested food. So animals with one opening will consume food through the mouth and excrete food through the same opening. So there's going to be a mixing of digested and undigested food. And we normally find that in a hydra. You find here's a hydra, and around the hydra you have the tentacles with one opening. It's also sessile, and then that is a disadvantage of an organism having one opening. Digested and undigested food can mix. Also, they're sessile, they cannot move around. So this one opening limits the amount of food that these animals can consume. Because food is coming in and food is going out, they cannot eat a large amount of food. They're slow moving also, so they don't need much food. Therefore, you find that organisms with one opening, they consume less food, right? Then you have an organism with two openings, like your earthworm, your annelida, mouth and an anus, means food coming in will not be mixed with food going out. So this is what we call a through gut. Food is moving through it. We call that a through gut. So there's no mixing of digested and undigested food, which shows you that an organism with two openings is far more advanced. And you're going to find that where the mouth end is, it's sensitive. It can be able to move and see what kind of soil is it going to eat. So earthworms basically feed on soil, right? All your soil, all your dead plant material with this mixed in the soil. That's what the earthworms eat. And they have a mouth end which is very sensitive to where they're moving. They must move forward and what they're going to eat. So this mouth end or head end displays what? Cephalization. So this is a two opening organism. Also cephalization, also triploblastic and far more efficient. Then you're going to see what is an acoelomate animal. An acoelomate animal means it's got an ectoderm and an endoderm. There is a body cavity there. Sorry, there's no body cavity. So you have an ectoderm, né? Then you have an endoderm. So a coelom, let's look at it. A coelom is a body cavity that develops inside the mesoderm tissue layer, and in more advanced animals, like we spoke about the earthworm having a coelom. Right. Acoelomate animals may be diploblastic. That means a flatworm has an ectoderm and an endoderm, only two layers, and they don't have a coelom, so they acoelomate. So animals with a coelom, like your annelida, are coelomate. Right. Acoelomate animals are smaller and less mobile. That means they don't move around too much. Okay, so an animal without a coelom, it doesn't have a proper skeleton, so they can't, locomotion is very limited. So, and they don't have a coelom that acts as a hydrostatic skeleton. Therefore, they are smaller and they're less mobile. Right. Then you're going to get coelom, which is a pseudocoelom. This is like a false, it's like a cavity, but it's a false cavity. It's not a proper coelom with coelomic fluid that acts as a hydrostatic skeleton. So coelomate animals have a body cavity or coelom, né, in the mesodermal layer. However, some animals which have three body layers is not surrounded by a mesoderm. So when there's no mesoderm, but there is like a cavity, then that is called a false cavity. So remember now, coelomate animals have a coelom, but some animals which have three body layers may not have a coelom. which comes from your mesoderm. There's no mesoderm that's giving rise to it. So that animal is called a pseudocoel organism. Right, and that one, this is a coelomate one, but you also get non-coelomate animals. This one is like a non-coelomate. There's a coelom, but it's not a true coelom as in the annelida or earthworm. Right, so here the cavity, remember, called a pseudocoel. What's a pseudocoel? A cavity, but it's not really a coelom. Right, and that's found in a nematode. What's a nematode? A nematode is actually your worms that live in your intestine, the parasitic worms. They don't move around because they hook onto your intestine, and those ones have a cavity called a pseudocoel. Right, so that's your nematodes. That is your tapeworms, which you're going to learn about as well. Now, what is the advantage of an earthworm having a coelom, a true body cavity filled with fluid called coelomic fluid? First of all, your coelom, because it's like a cavity, it's going to allow your complex organs to form. So, from your mesoderm, your ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm, your endoderm can give rise to different organs now because there's a cavity there. So your digestive system, like an earthworm, has a proper digestive system. It has a proper excretory system because there's a coelom available. So coelomate animals have an advanced digestive system. Because of the coelomic fluid, they have a hydrostatic skeleton, a force which allows for movement. Right. Then also, because of the coelom, the endoderm and the ectoderm are separated from each other. So the ectoderm is separated from the endoderm by means of the coelomic cavity. Right. And in some organisms, the coelomic fluid found in the coelom helps to transport nutrients. So the fluid itself also allows what? The removal of excretory wastes. So 4 functions of coelomate animals, 4 functions of the coelom. 1, it acts as a skeleton for movement. 2, because it's fluid, it assists in the transporting of nutrients from the digestive system to the cells. 3, right, you find that it's because of the coelom, the body is able to form internal organs like your digestive system. It can have bones and cartilage and ligaments and your heart. So all those organs develop because there is a coelom. Right. So let's look at this activity now. If you're looking at these animals, ask yourself, can I divide this animal into a left and right equal half? This one, I can divide it into an equal. So that's bilateral symmetry. This one, I have to move along this plane here to get an equal half, left and right half. That's bilateral. This one, I have to move along one plane like this to get an equal half. So that's also bilateral. So always look at it. Most animals that have a circumference will be radial. But like this, if you can divide it into equal left and right halves and not top and bottom parts, then this one is called bilateral. Same picture again. What are the advantages of an organism that has a bilateral symmetry? Because of cephalization, remember, a distinct front and back end, proper through gut. The animals are able to move through the environment in one direction because of cephalization. You move forward, we don't move backwards. And focus on the senses in the direction for feeding and avoiding predators. So if you bilateral, number 1, you have cephalization, sense organs in the front, which allows you to move forward. It allows you to look for food. It allows you to detect danger. All right. Now, activity 3, this is where most learners actually fail to identify the tissue layers and the organisms to which they belong. So let's identify the layers. Layer A is on the outside, so that will form what? Your ectoderm. Then you're going to find B. B is on the inside of the ectoderm, so that's going to be your endoderm. And then what's going to be C? In this diagram here, you can see that between the ectoderm and between the endoderm, this is the mesoderm. So remember, you don't find the mesoderm on the inside. The meso, M for middle, middle of the ectoderm and the endoderm, you're going to have your mesoderm. And here, your endoderm is going to give rise to all your hollow organs like your digestive system. And then here also is what? The cavity. The cavity allows for space for the development of your organs. Same picture again. Which diagram 1 or 2 is diploblastic? You can identify 1, 2 layers. So di for 2 layers, and obviously 2, you're going to see 1, 2, 3 layers. So if the question asks which one is triploblastic, it's going to be 2. Which one is diploblastic, it's going to be 1. Give a reason for your answer in the previous question. So you're going to see that here, 1 is diploblastic because it has 2 tissue layers, and triploblastic has 3 tissue layers. Activity 5, same picture again, different questions. What advantage does an organism with a mesoderm have? Remember, the mesoderm is found between ecto and endoderm. Mesoderm can develop organs, blood, bone, cartilage. So because of the mesoderm, because it's triploblastic, it's more advanced organs are formed from the mesoderm. Activity 6. Which diagram A, B, or C represents a pseudocoelomate? That means it has a cavity, or pseudocele. Pseudocele means false cavity. It's not coelomate. Which one is that one that is having a pseudo? It's pseudocoelomate, false cavity, not a true coelom. It is C because the body cavity is outside. You see, the body cavity is supposed to be on the inside of the mesoderm, but this body cavity is lying outside of the mesoderm. Remember, the mesoderm must be in the middle, right? And then your endoderm. But now here, when the body cavity is outside the mesoderm, here's the mesoderm. So this body cavity here is on the outside of the mesoderm instead of being inside of the endoderm. So instead, when it's inside of the endoderm, it's a true body cavity. But when it's outside of the mesoderm, it's not a true body cavity. It's called what? A pseudocoelomate. Which diagram A, B, or C represents an acoelomate? Means it does not have a body cavity. Now here is what we have, a digestive cavity. So that's not a body cavity, it's a digestive cavity. So it's going to be A. Okay, here you can see the body cavity, the coelom. So that one is coelomate, but this one, they are showing you that here is a digestive cavity. It's not just a cavity filled with fluid, but it has digestive organs. So A is acoelomate, not a proper coelom. Right, and then you're going to have your activity 6 also. Which diagram represents the most advanced organism? And the most advanced one is going to be here, because you have an ectoderm, a mesoderm, an endoderm, and all these also form your different organs. So you can see that this organism is far more advanced. Ne? It's going to be B. What advantage does a coelom give to an animal? Like if you have a body cavity like the earthworm with fluid filled on the inside, and it's on the inside of the endoderm, what does that coelom actually help in? We said it, because of the space, it allows complex organisms like your digestive system to form. It also creates a hydrostatic force or hydrostatic skeleton for movement. It also separates the endoderm from the ectoderm, so that there is movement in your digestive system for peristalsis. And the coelomic fluid helps to transport wastes. So these are the 4 advantages of a coelom in Annelida. So that brings us actually to the end of our lesson. Please ensure that you know your vocabulary for each section. Look at the pictures and have pictures to identify the labels. Thank you.